Let's talk about learning to live with no. What is it about the answer no that we struggle with so much? Have you ever seen the look of disappointment on a child's face when you say no? Have you ever seen the look of bewilderment on the face of somebody who is so used to having their way, but all of a sudden they come across the answer no, and they just don't know how to deal with that answer no? Michael J. Fox in an interview once talked about why it is that young stars and celebrities burn out so quickly. And he said they burn out quickly because they live in the land of yes. And in the land of yes, they never hear the word no. And they don't know how to live in an existence that places no boundaries around them. What is it as Christians that dealing with life and all the struggles in between, we come to that place of such difficulty when we have to deal with a no from an answer to prayer? Is it that we cannot live with the loss of control that a no from God represents? Is it that somehow we've just feel that we've come to the end of how far we can trust and how far we can pray and how far we can exercise our faith, and just hearing no from God will destroy us? Is it because we fear the vulnerability that we'll feel when the people who don't believe in God, who are looking on to see what God is going to do, how they'll react if God says no? Or is it that we just sometimes feel, come on, God, man, you owe me a yes. Yeah, you owe me a yes this time round. You owe me a yes this time round. And how about it when God says no with no explanation, like we sometimes do with our children? When God sometimes says it's a no because he says no. No, it's an end of discussion, no. It's a no, period, no. Is he still a loving? Is he still a knowing? Is he still an all-seeing and gracious God then? We often ask, why is it that God would say no? Why is it that when I need this so much that God would say no? When in actual fact, sometimes we need to question, why is it that we can't live with the fact that God says no? I mean, come on, think about this. 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, then 40 years in the desert. Moses had earned a yes, and yet God said no when he begged God to cross over Jordan into the land of Canaan in Deuteronomy chapter 3. Builder of a kingdom and a throne so great and so blessed that God said, I am going to sit on David's eternal throne. And yet, the greatest worshiper the Bible has ever known. And yet, in 2 Chronicles chapter 2, when he asked to build a temple, God said, no. This man had single-handedly probably written most of the New Testament, built up most of the churches of the New Testament. He had been stoned to death. He had been brought back to life. He had been shipwrecked. He had been whipped. He had been imprisoned by Jew and Gentile alike. And yet when Paul asked to have the thorn removed from his flesh 3 times, in 2 Corinthians 12, the answer came back, no. But let's bring it closer to God. Healer of the sick, raiser of the dead, feeder of thousands, comforter of the despised. Jesus had earned a yes in the garden when the cup shook in his hand. And yet the answer was no in Matthew 26, when he asked that the cup be removed and another way be found. Even God had to live with a no from God. Yeah, that's the best way to describe it. The rubber meets the road in a journey of faith when no means that we have to give God control of the wheel. We sometimes say, Jesus, take the wheel. But as long as the journey doesn't inconvenience me, but the rubber meets the road when a no means allowing God to take the wheel and actually drive. No doesn't mean that we've lost control. No sometimes mean that God is redefining what taking control actually means for us. Being in control actually means for us. Then at other times, no just simply means we have to learn to trust God beyond our ability to control the narrative. It means that our spiritualized, controlled freakness has to take second place so that God can allow his spirit to take first place in order for us to understand our space. And then sometimes no from God, it's just a no. Just no explanation, no reason, no conversation, like no. Can we still trust him then? Can we still love him then? Can we live through that type of no from God? And God said no to Moses. And yet God raised him up, took him to the heavenly Canaan, and then brought him back down. He still put his foot down on the earthly Canaan. But this time he was on the Mount of Transfiguration with Elijah, giving hope to God's son. God said no to David, and yet David said, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord. God said no to Paul, and yet Paul said, I know in who I have believed, and I am persuaded that he is able to keep the life that I have committed to him against that day. God said no to Jesus, and yet he raised him on the third day, and Jesus said, all power is given to me in heaven and on earth. So just go into the world and make disciples of all men. No doesn't always mean that we don't get the answer. No sometimes means that God is teaching us a bigger lesson than just him saying yes. It was 2007, and I had been diagnosed with cancer of the kidney. And they had discovered it because my right eye had hemorrhaged. The creatinine levels in my left kidney had shot up, and it hemorrhaged my right eye. They took the kidney, but in taking the kidney, they had taken all the cancer. I stayed off work for a good few months, and then I went back to work. But what people didn't know was I went back to work depressed. And I went back to work depressed because although I had been healed from the cancer, my eye never corrected itself. The partial sight loss remained, and I just went back with partial sight. And I prayed and I fasted. I called people around me who I trusted, anointed women and men of God who anointed me and prayed over me. And no matter how much we prayed, no matter how many other eye specialists I sought advice from, nothing happened. They kept on saying, it's not going to get worse, but it's not going to get better. After months of this, I remember one day God speaking to me, and God asked me, Eddie, how long did you know you were sick? I said, well, I didn't. And it was the truth. I didn't know how long I was sick because I didn't know how long this was growing inside me. And he said, and what happened when you went blind? And I said, and he said, going blind, you were able to see. Loss of sight in this specific place helped me to see a much bigger picture. And so I'm good. My eye hasn't come back. It hasn't got worse, but it hasn't got better. But I'm here and I'm testifying that God stays in our journey and he stays in our picture. So let's learn to live with God's no. Let's learn to trust God for a no. Let's learn to trust that God is looking at pictures bigger than we are. Let's learn to stay in that space of faith and agreement. Stay in that space of trusting that God's no in our lives can be as needed and as important as God saying yes.